Danny Funt is the author of the brand new book, Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. And he joins us this morning here on Jersey Magazine. Danny, you ask a question very early on in the book, and it continues throughout. What do we stand to gain, and what are we willing to lose? And that just repeats again and again and again through so many different scenarios in the book.
The more reporting I did, the harder I found it was to answer that basic question. I also felt like it's so fundamental. How did we, accept that sports gambling would take over sports for people who bet and for people who just want to watch a game without asking those basic questions? It seems like Americans were kind of cheated out of that debate.
And gambling is not new. As you point out, it goes back, it's in the Bible. So this is nothing new. There was one story that stood out to me. There was suspicious odds movement that were noted at Hoboken gambling halls. And it sounds very much like what happened with the Cleveland Guardians and a couple of their pitchers as Major League Baseball was noticing something going on. But that story that you told in the book goes back to 1876. So we're on a repetition cycle here.
We really are. How about that? I think it was the Louisville Grays were busted for throwing games 150 years ago. So, if anyone had any questions that gambling corrupts sports, they haven't been watching sports since they, emerged in the United States. That's for sure.
And that's something I think former Senator, New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley talked about because he was warning about, as you point out, athletes being turned into roulette chips, which there's a recent scandal. It's too recent for your book, in fact, with a number of college basketball players, including my alma mater of Fordham. Who would have seen that coming?
And my alma mater of Georgetown humiliated in that indictment when DePaul players were paid to throw the first half. So Georgetown was up, and then naturally, once the bet was off, DePaul came back and won. So it really adds so much cynicism to how we watch sports. You're wondering next time your team is, looking lame out there, what, is someone placing a bet that I don't know about? It's in the back of a lot of people's heads.
Yeah, as I watch games now, and you're thinking, like as you just said, in the back of your head, it's almost as if it's turned into professional wrestling. I don't know if what I'm watching, and I don't have a problem with gambling per se, but I don't know if what I'm watching on the professional level is legitimate anymore.
Lee Steinberg, a very famous former agent who represented Patrick Mahomes, Manny Ramirez, all sorts of superstars, used that exact expression that really, when you boil it down, all that sports has going for it is believability, that these guys are trying their absolute hardest and care about nothing other than winning. And 65% of Americans, if you can believe it, now suspect that some athletes are influencing how they play to shape the outcome of a bet. And commissioners used to warn about this for decades, that it would fundamentally erode our trust in sports if everyone was gambling.
You ask early on in the book another question: how has gambling affected our relationship to sports?
Yeah, what could be more basic than that? And this is another reason why, even if you're not betting, I think you'll take interest in this book and maybe be worried about what's happening because the whole business of sports is being transformed. Athletes' relationships with fans is being altered and maybe irreparably damaged just with the brutal harassment and threats that they now get on a game by game basis whenever their play costs someone a bet. And even young fans who now, if they don't have a bet on the line, they have no interest in watching a game. It just bores them. Like it would be like going to a racetrack and just watching for the sake of admiring the horses, feels antiquated. And maybe that's where we're headed with the rest of professional sports.
Back in 1992, the question was: were leagues and law enforcement equipped to stop gambling from corrupting sports? Speaking of professional sports. And I think the answer is a resounding no after we've seen what's gone on in the past however many years. You think of Tim Donaghy, the NBA referee back in the early 2000s, and what's been going on with different sports, college, we just mentioned, Major League Baseball with the Guardians. I think the answer is a resounding no, Danny.
You're absolutely right. I interviewed one of the highest ranking people who's responsible for detecting improper betting, like the next Donaghy scandal. And I asked him point blank, is there anything in place now that would stop exactly that from happening? You know, someone going to a street bookie or a gambling syndicate that's very sophisticated is not going to set off alarm bells. And he essentially said, no, we would have very little way of stopping that. So if the whole selling point of legalization was that it would allow the leagues to detect the next major fixing scandal in sports, if you talk to the people on the inside, as I have, they're incredibly skeptical that they're equipped to stop these things from happening.
I know noticed that commissioners from the five major sports and top current executives from FanDuel and DraftKings declined to be interviewed for your book. Why do you think that was? That's pretty obvious, I think, but I'll ask anyway.
I I suspect they don't have good answers to these questions. I also think they know, and this is me guessing, but I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. I think they know that some of this stuff is indefensible. And I'm hoping that by interviewing dozens and dozens of people who work at sports books who voiced concerns about how their business treats customers, and people attached to leagues who voiced alarm at what the embrace of gambling is doing to sports, I'm hoping it forces those people to address this book.
Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie was very, very aggressive in trying to get sports legal betting legalized here in New Jersey. He was hoping that it would revitalize the Atlantic City casinos, and at one point he announced that he was going to dedicate a certain percentage of the funds that the state would be getting towards treatment programs for compulsive gamblers. Do you remember what the actual amount he promised is and how it varies from what is actually going to those treatment programs here in New Jersey?
Yeah, I remember, on the trail, he said half of revenue from sports betting would go toward helping people with gambling problems, which is an outrageous promise. And of course, the actual number, which I don't remember, is nothing close to that. It's a sliver. And that, that was a pretty grandiose promise by former Governor Christie. But across the country, states have failed to deliver what health experts say is a bare minimum of funding for the inevitable health problems that's going to happen when you make it so easy to gamble. They say about 1% of the money raised in taxes from gambling should go to helping people who develop gambling problems. Obviously, they're in a tough place to pay for counseling and other treatment if they're in deep debt from gambling. And states just haven't delivered, and they don't feel that that's worth their while, I guess. And people are really bothered by that because the rates of gambling problems are surging in the tri-state area and all over.
Yeah, in fact, you note in the book that by 2023, residents of New Jersey suffered from gambling disorder at triple the national average.
Yeah, and I wonder if that foreshadows what the rest of the country is in for, because New Jersey has this decades-old casino business. They were early out the gates to legalize sports betting, of course. They also have online casino gambling where you can play things like slots and blackjack and craps from your phone. All of that is really playing with fire. And when I saw that study, which is exceptional, a lot of these prevalence issues have not been studied to the degree that Rutgers University did in that case. Yeah, it seemed like a warning for the rest of the country.
You point out in the book that it's often not the pursuit of money that leads people into gambling. What do you think it is?
It varies, but that's so important. Sometimes it's thrill seeking, especially nowadays. Even people at FanDuel told me when they've done customer surveys, it sounds like a lot of people betting are alone and lonely and just trying to liven up a night. And, if you place enough money, it feels like you're watching the Super Bowl any day of the year. I've felt that way too. It's remarkably seductive. There's also an element of escapism at play. Like if you're dealing with a lot of stress, you feel like you're the man if you're, winning money placing a bet. So, yeah, that also helps explain why athletes could get caught up betting. How much more money do you want if you're making tens of millions a year? And yet there's evidence to suggest athletes are prone to be some of the most ardent gamblers around because of those reasons I just mentioned.
Going back to earlier in our conversation, Fordham, Georgetown, I don't know that either of those schools are generating a lot of NIL money for their players. So I think it's easy to see why a kid from a Fordham or a Duquesne or a Georgetown, St. Bonaventure is another one of the schools that mentioned, you drop 10 to 30K in front of a 19, 20, 21 year old kid who's not getting NIL money. Gee, I'm not shocked he's taking it.
You're exactly right. It's such a basic point, and it's been lost on a lot of people. They say, "Wow, today's college athletes are making real money. They're not going to throw it all away by gambling." And in that indictment a week ago, prosecutors allege that these fixers specifically targeted guys who aren't making as much in NIL as their peers. And if I were a college student and my buddy or the guy I'm playing against is making $1 million, I might feel a little jealous. I might feel a little resentful. So if someone says, here's a bag of cash to influence the first half of a game, I think that'd be rather tempting. And yet I feel like a broken record, but a big piece of the book is just to show how hollow some of these arguments are, why gambling isn't a threat to sports.
The book is called Everybody Loses: The Tumultuous Rise of American Sports Gambling. Danny Funt, congratulations on the book and thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you, Jim. My pleasure.